Psalm 64. Psalm 64 details for us the troubles of God's king as he is plotted against by a rowdy crowd of wicked enemies. It records for us his prayer for preservation. That in itself should be a surprise for us. God's king, or God's Messiah, God's Christ, for those three words are all interchangeable. They're just in different languages. God's king, God's Christ, God's Messiah is by definition the blessed one. And yet here he is in Psalm 64 praying for preservation from the plots of perverse men. God's king was meant to be a God-empowered, victorious conqueror, pouring out peace and prosperity. He was meant to be a rewarder of the good and the punisher of the bad. So how then can he face such troubles? And this has been a question that has been building for some time. Psalms 52 through to 60 set out 8 different situations where the king is facing trouble and oppression-specific opposition. Psalms 61, 62, 63 are prayers of the king for help. And Psalm 64 that we come to today is a sibling of Psalm 63. It's like they hold hands together as a pair, not of identical twins, but of either non-identical twins or brother and sister. Think of Psalm 63 as a picture, and Psalm 64 as the negative of that picture. What was black is now white, and what was white is now black. One writer puts it like this: Psalm 63 focused on God with the enemy at the edges. Here in Psalm 64, the composition is reversed, but the outcome is the same. So same outcome, but different focus. What that means is Psalm 63 and 64 both looking at a similar, if not the same situation. But Psalm 63 has God in the foreground and the foes in the background. Psalm 64 has the foes in the foreground and God in the background or around the edges. The situation, the outcomes are the same, they just have a different focus. Or to put it slightly differently, Psalm 63 looks at the situation and asks, is God enough in this situation when you have nothing? Psalm 64 looks at the same situation and says, well, what about the problem? What about the problem that's causing this situation? The focus in Psalm 64 is on the foes, on the enemies, the opponents. Now that's very good, very neat, very clever, but what relevance has that for us? The similarities and yet different focuses of these Psalms. Maybe we're listening to this and we're thinking, I don't have any enemies. There's certainly nobody trying to, in the words of Psalm 64, ambush me. Or we could look at it, well, I do have people who cause me trouble, but I don't think of them as my enemies because, in fact, for most of us, more often than not, those that cause us the most trouble are our own family and friends. The hardest trouble comes closest to home, and we don't like the thought of putting their faces on something like Psalm 64. Or maybe we read of Christians persecuted in places like Malaysia, where they can be abducted for trying to change their religion on their identity card, and we understand the relevance of Psalm 64 for them. But what relevance does it have for us? Well, in all of the Bible story, from Genesis all the way through to Revelation, we need to realize that opposition, wherever it arises from, whether it's Cain killing Abel, or Saul chasing David, or the Roman authorities persecuting the early church in the first century, all of that, from Genesis to Revelation, is a manifestation, or even better, a humanization of Satan's hatred and attacking of God's people. He's the common foe. He's the opponent that we all face, the one who troubles us all, whether it's through the authorities persecuting Christians, or trouble stirred up by friends, families, or outright foes, he's the ultimate source. We all face the evil one, whether it's as Christians who are tempted, tripped up, terrorized by him, or even simply as humans, because Satan has a hatred towards humanity. Humanity bears the image of God, and he's seeking to destroy the entire race and damn us all. He has a raging hatred against all that God is and all that God does. And so we all, as part of God's creation, as part of God's people, we all live in the firing line. So the question this morning then is, how does Psalm 64 help us? How do we survive and overcome this opponent, whatever form he takes outwardly? How do we overcome this? Well, first of all, Psalm 64 gives us a prayer in the face of hidden evil. A prayer in the face of hidden evil. Psalm 64, of course, is not unique in dealing with opposition and evil. As we mentioned at our Bible study on Tuesday night, many of the Psalms do deal with opposition and evil, and perhaps that catches us by surprise as we read them, as we sing them. But often they'll consider the same issue, this hatred, this enmity that stems from Satan and manifested in many different ways. Often these Psalms will deal with the same topic, but look at it from different angles. And Psalm 64 does that. It speaks to us particularly about hidden evil. It speaks in verse 2 of the secret plots of the wicked. Verse 4, it describes them lying in ambush and shooting from their hiding places like snipers. The attack is sudden and without warning, verse 4. Verse 5, we're told that they hide their traps like a hunter. The traps are unseen, and they are unseen as they lay their traps. They're confident in their prowess. Verse 6, they say, verse 5, who can see them? Who can see us? The attack and the evil intention that lies behind it is hidden. And it's not simply a hidden attack, hidden evil from an individual. It speaks of a throng. There's a mob, there's a posse, there's an alliance, there's a collective, secret offensive. And this is the Bible's description of the evil and the hatred that the believer faces. It's not obvious, it's not plain and upfront, it's unseen, it's concealed, and it's secret. But there is a conspiracy, there's a plot. There are schemes in the shadows. And the language used here, the descriptions given here, echo Psalm 2, one of those great entrance pillars that help us understand all of the Psalms. Why do the nations rage? Psalm 64 talks about the people raging. People's vain things mastermind. The kings of earth take their stand. Rulers are in league, in alliance combined. Here's a raging mob conspiring to hurt and to harm. We live in a day and age where conspiracy theories are rife. They've been in the headlines this year, whether it's QAnon or 5G or Bill Gates and nanobots and the vaccine. 2020 was the year of the conspiracy theory, and they no longer seem like the fringe views of a bunch of radical loony bins. They've gone mainstream. And if we stop and pause for a moment, I think we can see the appeal of a conspiracy theory to many in our world. Somebody powerful somewhere is doing something that they shouldn't, and they're hiding it from us. That's the underlying principle of a conspiracy theory. And when we put it like that, it's not a massive jump for us to grant that somebody powerful somewhere is doing something that they shouldn't, and they're hiding it from us. The only question is that where do you draw the line as to how far this goes? There's an element of truth in the idea that underlines or drives conspiracy theories. There is a conspiracy. There's a conspiracy to harm and attack the church and all of humanity, and it's secret and unseen. It's a threat from the shadows. It's a hidden evil. And yet it's not like many of the conspiracy theories that you'll read of online, because it's pretty simple and straightforward. It's not convoluted and obscure. It's outlined in this psalm for us. The conspiracy's goal, we're told, is the life of God's people. David prays, Lord, preserve my life. They're out to get him. It's destruction that they want. That's the goal of it. The target is the blameless. They want to attack God's people. But more particularly, the goal is the life of God's king. This is a rebellion against God's representative and God's rule on earth. That was Satan's target from the beginning. He didn't come and tempt the elephants. He didn't tempt the fruit trees. He came to mankind, the pinnacle of creation, God's representative, God's king on earth. And that's the goal of his conspiracy to this day, to destroy God's king. We're told in Psalm 64 of the conspiracies, agents, evildoers, they're described in verse 2. They have wicked hearts and wicked actions. Satan uses men and women. His agents that he uses. We're told of their weapons. In verse 3, their weapons are their tongues and words, as it was from the start. He used a snake that could talk. His weapon was words. Words aimed to hurt and destroy. We see a strategy in Psalm 64. Ambush, stealth, surprise, suddenness. And we see the heart of the conspiracy. Verse 5. They hold fast to their evil purpose. They talk of laying snares secretly, thinking, who sees them? They are persistent and dogged. They consider themselves untouchable. Sure, what is it? Who sees us? And verse 6, they're thorough in their planning. We have accomplished a diligent search. We have sought out all the injustices we can do, and we will do them. And it all arises from the depths of their inner being. Verse 6, the inward mind and heart of a man are deep. Here's the conspiracy, laid out for us plain as day. And friends, I have three simple points to make as we reflect on this. First of all, we need to realize that this is the world around us. This is the world around us. It started in the Garden of Eden. It's driven by rebellious hearts, and it's directed by Satan. This is the world around us that's described. Secondly, we need to realize that because of that, this is what we were and what we still are if we're not yet Christians. This is us that is being described. This is a conspiracy that we were part of. And so we don't look out there with pride. As we read these verses, as we sing them later on, see yourself here first of all. See yourself before God's grace touched your life and turned you around. We see ourselves here. But thirdly, the response to this danger that we face in our world, it's not panic, it's prayer. Verse 1, hear my voice, O God, in my complaint. Preserve my life from the dread of the enemy. Hide me from the secret plots of the wicked, from the throng of evildoers. Conspiracy theories are driven by the thought that somebody powerful somewhere is doing something that they should not be doing, and they're hiding it from us. And this psalm tells us that there is an element of truth to that, and it tells us that the correct response is not paranoia, it's not panic, it's not despair, it's prayer. The correct response is prayer. And so Psalm 64 gives us a prayer to pray in the face of hidden evil. But secondly, in the second half of the psalm, we're given a hope in the face of hidden evil. How do we live in the face of this hidden evil? Because as we said, it's not just the persecuted church in Iran or Malaysia, Pakistan, for whom this song is relevant. All Christians are opposed and targeted. Satan just has different methods for different situations. It's more out in the open in those countries. It's more covert here. The secret plans and purposes of evil men harm all people, not just Christians. And there's so many people in our world who are looking for an answer to the suffering that has been inflicted upon them unjustly by others. People who are scarred and hurt by abuse and injustice. And they're looking for hope in this world. So what hope is there for us in the face of hidden evil? Well, Psalm 64 paints a picture that gives us hope. It paints a picture of a great reversal. A great reversal. We've been told that the evildoers shoot suddenly to harm. And then in verse 7 we're told, but God shoots suddenly at them. There's a great reversal. We're told that they attack with words sharpened like arrows, but God brings their arrow words back on them. Verse 8. They are brought to ruin with their own tongues turned against them. Their own tongues that they had sharpened like arrows. Their own weapons turned back on them. The great reversal. We're told that they made secret plots and they make hidden attacks. But verse 8 and 9, their defeat will be seen and publicly proclaimed. All who see them will wag their heads in mockery and in wonder. Then all mankind fears. They will tell what God has brought about and ponder what has been done. The veil of secrecy will be torn away. And there's a certainty about the words in the second half of the psalm. There's a force. They speak as if they've already happened. It's so sure and so certain. And friends, this is our hope in the face of Satan's shadowy plan to hurt mankind and hurt God's people as part of mankind. This is our hope in the face of the hidden injustices and evils that we face and the hurts that we endure. There will be a great reversal. There will be a global public reckoning and accounting. There will be public justice and there will be public deliverance for God's people. And so when we are struggling, when we feel like tiny little pawns in a much bigger game, that somebody powerful somewhere is doing something that they shouldn't be and they're hiding it from us, or whenever we're feeling the weight of the injustices and suffering that we have endured, here's our hope. God's great reversal. God's great reversal where the attacks will be turned back on the attackers. God's justice is like a boomerang. As people have done, so it will be done to them. That's the essence of justice as portrayed to us again and again in the Bible. Do to others as you would have them do to you. An eye for an eye. God's ultimate justice is like that. The evil that they do comes back on them. Their wicked arrow-like words to harm and hurt, they will be slain by arrow-like words. Their own tongues, their own words turned back on them. There's a fairness and a proportionality to God's justice. God's great reversal where hidden evil will be brought to light. Evil will be seen for what it is. God's fairness will be seen. Those who have been unjustly treated, they'll be vindicated. All will see. God's great reversal where prayer, like at the start of the psalm, is turned to praise at the end of the psalm. Verse 10. Let the righteous one rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. Let all the upright in heart exult. In the face of hidden evil, in the face of this world, and all Satan's plots and schemes and plans, here's our great hope, our only hope. The great reversal. God's justice coming. And if we want to survive the satanic plot to harm and hinder God's people, to destroy the image of God in mankind, to delete, as it were, God's stamp of ownership on humanity, if we want to survive this veiled threat, we must look to God, because it's He who brings this justice, this great reversal. We must look to Him. Verse 7, but God will do this. And that's the message of this psalm. We don't overcome evil by ourselves. God overcomes evil. And He does it by using Satan's own weapons against him. Verse 8. They are brought to ruin with their own tongues turned against them. God overcomes evil using Satan's own weapons against him. That's the message of Psalm 64. But that leaves us with a problem. We thought earlier of how we are part of the conspiracy. When we compare what the Bible says with our own hearts, we see that these dangerous, evil-tongued people, well, that's us. That's us by ourselves in our nature. And yet, this psalm is a hope for us. It finishes with rejoicing. How can David, who had a wicked heart like us, how can he write these words? How can he finish with rejoicing in the face of all this? Well, the answer is seen as we look past and beyond David. David was God's king, God's Messiah, God's Christ. Interchangeable words. God's king, God's Messiah, God's Christ, who was attacked and hunted, who prayed to God. And we see in David, in his life, in his experiences, in his words, we see the shadow of one of his descendants, a far greater king, the final Messiah, the final Christ. Picture one of his descendants. Picture the Lord Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's living this psalm. Evildoers are plotting in secret against him. They are, like the people described in Psalm 64, convinced of their own uprightness. They are convinced that their plans are unseen. They are aiming their words like arrows. They're picking just the right charge to incite the Roman authorities into administering the death penalty. They're gathering together in groups, coordinating false witnesses for the show trial. Their words are weapons. They've dispatched a rowdy throng to arrest him. And behind it all is the hand of Satan. This is a rebellion against God's rule, against God's king, against God's representative on earth. He's going to kill God's king. He's going to put him on the cross. But God shoots his arrow at them, and they are wounded suddenly. They are brought to ruin with their own tongues turned against them, and all who see them will wag their heads. Then all mankind fears. God does what he does. He takes Satan's own weapon and turns it against himself. And as Satan strikes the king on the cross, his own attack is turned against him, like we read the snake that would see the hunter and strike and bite the heel. But as he bites the heel, his head is smashed and he's killed. His own attack turned against him. His own attack on the cross turned to his own destruction. As Jesus dies on the cross, he pays the debt to God's justice for the sin of his people. He's treated like the evildoer that we all deserve to be treated as. He is judged so that we won't be judged, and he, to use the words of Psalm 64, is brought to ruin so that we won't be brought to ruin. But he rises to life again in victory. The attack of the evil one turned back on him, and Satan's power is broken. The curse of sin is lifted, and the harm that is done to us is healed and will be healed. And it's for all those who will take refuge in him. Here is, as the psalm speaks about, global deliverance and cause for rejoicing. Then all mankind fears. They tell what God has brought about and ponder what he has done. Let the righteous one rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. Let all the upright hear and exult. Here's good news for all the earth, for those who take refuge in him. So are you taking refuge in him? What does it look like to take refuge in him? It looks like the prayer of verses 1 and 2. Hear my voice, O God, in my complaint. Preserve my life from dread of the enemy. Hide me from the secret plots of the wicked. Taking refuge in God means putting all your hope in God, not yourself. Taking refuge in God means looking solely to him. That's what David does at the start of the psalm. God, hide me, preserve me. I have nothing but you. In a world of hidden evil, here we have hope. Refuge in God. There's our hope. So take refuge in God. Amen.